The morning sun painted golden streaks across Courtroom 7A's polished wooden floors, casting long shadows behind the rows of empty benches. Judge William Harrison arrived precisely at 8:45 a.m., just as he had done every weekday for the past 15 years. His chambers felt particularly stuffy this morning, despite the gentle hum of the air conditioning. As he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and settled into his high-backed leather chair, his clerk, Jenny Martins, appeared with his morning coffee, black, no sugar, and a towering stack of case files. "It's going to be a busy one today, Your Honor," she said, placing the files carefully on his desk. 37 cases before lunch. Judge Harrison merely nodded, already immersed in the first file. His reputation for efficiency was well earned. He took pride in running the tightest schedule in the courthouse. Some of his colleagues joked that he could time travel, given how quickly he moved through his docket, while never missing a crucial detail. The clock struck 9, and the courtroom began to fill. The usual Monday morning crowd filtered in. Attorneys in rushed conversations with their clients, court officers maintaining order, and citizens summoned for various infractions. The air grew thick with anticipation and nervous energy. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the room as Judge Harrison emerged from his chambers, his black robe flowing behind him like a shadow. He took his seat at the bench, surveying the crowd before him with practiced detachment. The first few cases proceeded like clockwork. Traffic violations, minor disputes, and municipal infractions. Each received exactly 7 minutes of the judge's attention, no more, no less. His gavel punctuated the morning air with mechanical precision. At 10:23 a.m., Sarah Johnson's case was called. She rose from her seat in the third row, moving with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the hurried atmosphere of the courtroom. Her blazer, though not expensive, was immaculately pressed, and her shoulder-length hair was neatly styled. Something about her bearing made several heads turn. Perhaps it was her straight posture or the confident way she carried herself despite the circumstances. Judge Harrison glanced down at the case file before him, noting the charge: parking in a restricted zone outside the city library. His eyes skimmed over the basic information. Sarah Johnson, 35, resident of Oak Park, no prior citations. The photograph attached to the ticket showed a silver sedan partially blocking a loading zone. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his tone carrying the same efficient detachment he'd used all morning. "You're here regarding a parking violation on March 15th at 2:45 p.m. How do you plead?" Sarah stepped forward to the podium, her movements measured and deliberate. "Your Honor, I would like to explain the circumstances." Judge Harrison cut her off with a slight wave of his hand, a gesture he perfected over years of maintaining courtroom control. "The question, Ms. Johnson, is simple. How do you plead to the charge of parking in a restricted zone?" The courtroom fell silent, save for the gentle whirring of the overhead fans. Through the tall windows, the morning sun had climbed higher, and the golden streaks had faded, replaced by the harsh clarity of mid-morning light. In that moment, neither the judge nor the other observers noticed the slight squaring of Sarah's shoulders, a subtle tell that would have been instantly recognized by anyone familiar with military bearing. Sarah's voice carried clearly through the courtroom as she responded, "Guilty, Your Honor." Her admission came without hesitation, though her eyes held a quiet request to explain further. The morning light caught a small pin on her lapel, a detail so minute that even the ever-observant Judge Harrison failed to notice its military significance. Judge Harrison made a quick note in the file, his Mont Blanc pen gliding across the paper with practiced efficiency. He'd heard thousands of cases like this before, and his mind was already moving to the next one on his docket. The courthouse clock ticked steadily in the background, marking each precious second of his carefully scheduled morning. "Ms. Johnson, given that this is a restricted zone violation and considering the location's importance as a public service area, this court takes such infractions seriously," he announced, his tone carrying the weight of 15 years on the bench. He barely looked up as he continued. The maximum fine for this violation is $500, which I'm imposing in full. The court must discourage. A slight shift in the gallery caught his attention. An elderly gentleman in the back row, a regular courthouse observer known for his own military service, sat up straighter, his eyes fixed on Sarah with sudden recognition. But the judge, focused on his schedule, pressed on. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in a stance that would have been instantly familiar to anyone with military experience. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried the same steady calm that had helped her lead troops through sandstorms and firefights. Your Honor, I understand the seriousness of the violation. However, I was responding to Ms. Johnson. Judge Harrison interrupted, his patience wearing thin as he watched the clock tick toward his next case. The time for explanations was during the discovery phase. We're here today for sentencing. He shuffled the papers on his desk, already reaching for the next file. The morning sun had shifted now, casting harsh shadows across the courtroom. Sarah remained at the podium, her composure unwavering despite the dismissal in the judge's tone. The elderly observer in the back row had pulled out his phone, typing frantically as if searching for something important. Jenny Martinez, the clerk who had served Judge Harrison his coffee earlier, appeared at the side entrance of the courtroom. Her face showed unusual urgency as she clutched a folder marked with red tabs, the kind reserved for priority information. She caught the bailiff's eye, gesturing emphatically. If there's nothing else, Judge Harrison continued, this court orders the fine to be paid within 30 days. Next case. Your Honor. Jenny's voice cut through the courtroom, breaking every protocol she'd learned in her 3 years as a clerk. Her interruption drew a sharp look from the judge, but she pressed forward, making her way to the bench with the urgent folder. The elderly observer in the back had risen to his feet, his phone screen displaying what appeared to be a news article with a familiar face. Sarah Johnson remained still, her eyes forward, as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds outside, flooding the courtroom with revealing light. Judge Harrison's hand froze over his gavel as Jenny placed the folder before him. The red tabs marked Military Service Record and Distinguished Service stood out boldly against the manila background, and for the first time that morning, his carefully maintained schedule seemed to pause. Jenny's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder before Judge Harrison. The first page revealed a military photograph of Sarah Johnson in her dress uniform, rows of medals adorning her chest. The judge's eyes widened as he scanned the document, his reading glasses slipping slightly down his nose. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Johnson, Jenny announced, her voice carrying through the now silent courtroom. United States Air Force, 20 years of distinguished service. She paused, glancing at Sarah, who maintained her composed stance at the podium. Your Honor, there's more. The elderly observer in the back had made his way to the front row, his phone screen displaying a news article from 3 years ago. Air Force officer leads crucial rescue mission, saves dozens. The photograph showed a younger Sarah Johnson, dust-covered but determined, helping evacuate civilians from a disaster zone. Judge Harrison's fingers traced the service record before him. 3 bronze stars, a silver star, and numerous commendations filled the pages. But it was the citation for her last mission that made him pause, a humanitarian operation at the very library where she had received her parking ticket. Ms. Johnson, the judge began, his voice noticeably softer. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, I should say. He removed his glasses, finally looking at her, really looking at her, for the first time. Would you care to explain the circumstances of March 15th now? Sarah nodded, her voice steady as she spoke. I was meeting with a group of veterans at the library, Your Honor. We run a weekly support program there. She paused, choosing her words carefully. One of our youngest members was experiencing a severe panic attack. The only parking space available was the loading zone. I made a choice. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to soften, casting a gentle glow across the courtroom. The elderly observer nodded knowingly, He had attended those very meetings. Judge Harrison looked down at his own desk, where a photograph of his son in uniform sat facing him every day. The young veteran, Sarah continued, needed immediate assistance. As his commanding officer in Afghanistan, I knew his triggers. Sometimes 30 seconds can make the difference between a crisis and a breakthrough. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. Judge Harrison stood slowly, an unprecedented action in his courtroom. The weight of his earlier dismissal pressed upon him as he looked at the decorated officer before him. In his mind's eye, he saw his own son, serving somewhere overseas, perhaps needing someone like Sarah Johnson one day. "Lieutenant Colonel," he said, his voice carrying a new respect, "your service record is extraordinary, but it's your continued dedication to your fellow veterans that truly stands out." He lifted his gavel, then set it down again without using it. "This court owes you an apology." The morning light caught the single tear that had formed in Jenny's eye as she gathered the papers. The elderly observer pulled out his veterans organization card, ready to invite more service members to their library meetings, and Sarah Johnson, for the first time that morning, allowed herself a small smile. The clock on the wall continued its steady march forward, but Judge Harrison no longer glanced at it. Some moments, he realized, deserved all the time they needed. His carefully maintained schedule could wait. This was about something far more important than efficiency. Judge Harrison's chambers felt different when he returned during the lunch recess. The familiar space, with its dark wood paneling and walls of leather-bound law books, seemed to hold new shadows in its corners. He walked to his window, watching the courthouse square below where people hurried about their daily lives. His hand reached for the silver frame on his desk, the photo of his son, Michael, in his Marine dress uniform. The proud smile, so similar to his own, stared back at him. He hadn't spoken to Michael in 2 weeks, their last conversation brief and hurried. Too busy with the docket, he had told himself. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Jenny stood in the doorway, holding a manila folder. "I did some additional research on Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, Your Honor." She stepped inside, placing the folder on his desk. "She's been running the Veterans Support Program at the library for 3 years now. They meet every Tuesday and Thursday." The judge opened the folder, finding newspaper clippings and community reports. Photos showed Sarah working with young veterans, her face patient and understanding as she listened to their stories. One article detailed how she transformed the library's basement into a safe space for veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress. "The young man she helped that day," Jenny continued, her voice soft, "was Private James Cooper, 22 years old. She served as his commanding officer during his first deployment." She paused, watching the judge's expression. "He's alive today because she noticed his distress signals." Judge Harrison sank into his chair, the weight of the morning's events settling on his shoulders. How many times had he rushed through his cases, seeing only the infractions and not the people? How many stories had he missed in his pursuit of efficiency? He reached for his phone, scrolling to Michael's number. His son answered on the third ring, surprise evident in his voice. "Dad, is everything okay? You never call during court hours." "Everything's fine, son," he replied, his voice catching slightly. "I just wanted to hear your voice. Tell me about your day." As Michael shared stories about his unit and their daily routines, Judge Harrison's eyes drifted to the afternoon's docket sitting on his desk. Names and case numbers, each one a person with their own story, their own circumstances. He had always prided himself on his fairness, but today had shown him the difference between being fair and being just. Jenny reappeared at the doorway, gesturing that court would resume in 5 minutes. The judge nodded, still listening to his son. Before hanging up, he made sure to say the words he'd been too busy to say lately. "I love you, Michael. Stay safe." Standing to return to the courtroom, Judge Harrison straightened his robe. The familiar weight of the black fabric felt like a renewed responsibility on his shoulders. Through his window, he could see Sarah Johnson walking across the courthouse square, likely heading to the library for another veterans meeting. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his chamber floor, reminding him of the morning's events. His efficient 7-minute rule for cases suddenly seemed inadequate. Some stories needed more time to be heard, some truths needed space to emerge, and some judgments needed more than a cursory glance. The library basement hummed with quiet conversation as Sarah arranged chairs in a circle for the afternoon veterans meeting. The events of the morning lingered in her mind, but her focus remained on the task ahead. Private Cooper sat in his usual corner, early as always, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. "Everything okay, James?" she asked, pulling up a chair beside him. The young man's shoulders relaxed slightly at her familiar presence. He nodded, managing a small smile. "I wanted to apologize again, Mom," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I hadn't, that day, you wouldn't have gotten the ticket." His eyes remained fixed on the floor, shame evident in his hunched posture. Sarah leaned forward, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had guided her troops through countless missions. "James, look at me." She waited until he met her gaze. "There's nothing to apologize for. Part of being a family is being there for each other, no matter what." The room gradually filled with other veterans, each carrying their own visible and invisible battles. Sarah greeted them all by name, noting their moves, their progress, their struggles. This was her new mission field, not the dusty streets of foreign lands, but the quiet corners of their hometown where healing happened one conversation at a time. An unexpected figure appeared in the doorway. Judge Harrison, his black robe replaced by a simple suit. The room fell silent as he stepped inside, but Sarah stood calmly, offering him a respectful nod. "Lieutenant Colonel Johnson," he said, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty unusual for a man accustomed to commanding rooms. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Sarah gestured to an empty chair in the circle. "We welcome all who wish to understand, Your Honor." Her words carried no bitterness, no resentment for the morning's events. Several veterans exchanged glances, recognition dawning on their faces as they connected the judge to the courthouse stories they'd heard. Judge Harrison took the offered seat, looking surprisingly small without his elevated bench and formal robes. Private Cooper shifted uncomfortably, but Sarah's steady presence kept the room calm. "I thought," the judge began, clearing his throat. "I thought perhaps I could learn something here. My son, he's serving now, and I realize there's so much I don't understand." Sarah nodded, a gentle smile touching her lips. "Understanding is where healing begins, Your Honor, both for those who serve and those who wait for them." She turned to address the group, her leadership naturally emerging without any need for rank or title. "Today, we're talking about bridges," she continued, including the judge in her gaze. "Not the ones we crossed in combat, but the ones we build here at home, between who we were and who we're becoming, between those who served and those who seek to understand." The afternoon light filtered through the basement windows, casting warm patterns across the circle of chairs. In this space, there were no ranks, no titles, no judgments, only people seeking connection and understanding. Private Cooper straightened in his chair, his drumming fingers finally still. Judge Harrison pulled out a small notebook, ready to listen rather than pronounce judgment. And Sarah Johnson, decorated veteran and quiet community leader, began weaving another kind of connection, one story at a time. 2 weeks after the courthouse incident, Sarah stood before a classroom of law students at the local university. Judge Harrison had invited her to speak about leadership and understanding, and the lecture hall was filled to capacity. Students leaned forward in their seats, notebooks open, as she shared her perspective on justice and compassion. "Leadership isn't about the medals," she explained, touching the small pin on her blazer. "It's about seeing the person behind every case, every incident, every moment of crisis." Her eyes met Judge Harrison's as he sat quietly in the back row, nodding in agreement. A young woman raised her hand, her expression earnest. "Lieutenant Colonel, how do you balance rules with compassion, especially in high-pressure situations?" Sarah smiled, remembering countless decisions made in the field. Rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. The true test of leadership is knowing when adherence to rules supports justice and when it hinders it. The presentation slides behind her showed images of the library's Veterans Program, now expanded with the courthouse's support. Judge Harrison had helped secure additional funding, transforming the basement space into a proper Veterans Resource Center. Private Cooper's photo appeared on one slide, showing him helping new members feel welcome. After the lecture, Judge Harrison approached the podium as students filed out. "You've given them a lot to think about," he said, gesturing to the departing crowd, myself included. Sarah gathered her materials, her movements still carrying that military precision. "Change starts with understanding, Your Honor. These future lawyers and judges, they needed to hear about the human side of justice as much as the legal side." They walked together through the university hallways, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Students whispered and pointed, recognizing them from the local news coverage of their story. But neither Sarah nor the judge paid attention to the attention they drew. "Michael called last night," Judge Harrison shared as they reached the building's entrance. "He asked about the Veterans Program. Says he might want to help when he returns home." Sarah's face brightened. "We'd welcome him. Every voice adds something valuable to our circle." Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the campus buildings in warm hues. A group of veterans from the library program waited near the steps. They had all come to support Sarah's presentation. Private Cooper stood among them, standing taller now, more confident. "Lieutenant Colonel," one of them called out, "we've got that dinner reservation waiting. Will Judge Harrison be joining us?" The judge checked his watch, once a gesture of rushing to the next appointment, now a simple habit. "I'd be honored," he replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. As they walked toward their cars, Sarah noticed a parking ticket on a student's windshield. The young woman who had asked about rules and compassion during the lecture stared at it in dismay. Sarah and Judge Harrison exchanged knowing looks. The judge reached for his wallet, but Sarah held up her hand. "Let me," she said with a smile. Sometimes the best way to teach compassion is to show it. The students' eyes widened with recognition as Sarah approached. Behind them, the veterans group watched with knowing smiles, understanding that healing and growth happened in these small moments of connection, these tiny bridges built between strangers who might become friends. 1 month later, the courthouse underwent a subtle but significant transformation. Where there had once been only stark notices and legal documents on the walls, photographs now hung in elegant frames, images of local veterans, first responders, and community heroes. Judge Harrison had personally overseen the installation, ensuring each picture told a story of service and dedication. Sarah walked through the courthouse hallway, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She paused at one particular photo, a group shot of her Veterans Support Group, now officially partnered with the court system's community outreach program. Private Cooper stood front and center, his smile genuine and confident, a far cry from the troubled young man who had needed her help that fateful day. Jenny Martinez hurried up to her, clutching a stack of papers. "Lieutenant Colonel, the first draft of the training program is ready for your review." The clerk's enthusiasm was contagious. Together, they had developed a sensitivity training course for court employees, focusing on understanding the unique challenges faced by veterans and other community members. Inside Courtroom 7A, Judge Harrison's morning session looked remarkably different from just a month ago. The rigid 7-minute rule had been replaced by a more flexible approach. Each case received the time it needed, each story the attention it deserved. His reputation for efficiency had evolved into one of thorough understanding. "Your Honor," Sarah said, entering the empty courtroom during the lunch break. The Chief Justice called. "He wants to implement our program across all district courts." The judge looked up from his desk, his eyes bright with purpose. "This is bigger than both of us now, isn't it?" He gestured to a chair, inviting her to sit. On his desk, next to his son's photo, stood a new frame, the article about their story, a reminder of how one moment could change everything. "Michael's unit is coming home next month," he shared, his voice warm with anticipation. "He's already asked about joining our program as a mentor." Sarah nodded, remembering her own return from deployment. The transition isn't always easy, but having a purpose, a way to serve here at home, it makes all the difference. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. Private Cooper entered, carrying a large box. "The new brochures are here, ma'am." "Sir." His posture was military perfect, but his expression was relaxed, comfortable. Together, they opened the box, revealing glossy pamphlets titled Understanding Hearts, a guide to community-focused justice. The cover featured the courthouse steps, with people of all backgrounds coming together, symbolizing the bridge they were building between different parts of their community. "We've come a long way from a parking ticket," Sarah mused, picking up one of the brochures. Judge Harrison chuckled, a sound that would have been unthinkable in his courtroom 2 months ago. "Sometimes the best changes come from our most humbling moments." The afternoon sun streamed through the courtroom windows, casting a warm glow on the three of them. The judge who had learned to see beyond his assumptions, the veteran who had turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for change, and the young soldier who had found his strength through their combined support. Outside, the sounds of the city continued. Cars passing, people talking, life moving forward. But inside this courtroom, something precious had taken root, a deeper understanding of justice, compassion, and the power of seeing the person behind every story.